While I was on a business trip overseas, my wife sold our home to pay her LOVERS debt. I thought I knew her until she sold everything behind my back. It's not every day you come home to find out your life's been stolen. But you won't believe what I did next. Keep watching, because by the end of this video, you'll see exactly how I turned betrayal into the ultimate comeback. I still remember that night vividly. I had just finished a long day at the conference, the kind of high-stakes investment summit that demands every ounce of your focus and leaves you utterly drained. I was in my hotel room in Manhattan, surrounded by the dull hum of the city honking cabs, distant sirens, the constant electric buzz that never stops. I should have been exhausted, ready to collapse into bed, but my mind was too wired. These kinds of events always have a way of keeping your brain spinning, running over the deals you've made, the connections you've fostered, the presentations you gave. Even when you think it's over, it's never really over. I poured myself a drink, something smooth and amber that warmed my chest as I took the first sip. It was meant to help me unwind, but it didn't do the trick. I leaned back in the chair, laptop open, scrolling through the endless tide of emails that had piled up while I was in meetings. Market updates, client inquiries, scheduling reminders, none of it particularly interesting. Just the usual flood of digital noise. My fingers worked automatically, my eyes scanning subject lines until one jumped out at me. It was from Lena. The subject simply read, "A little change." My wife isn't the sentimental type. She doesn't send emails out of the blue. Usually, if there's something to say, it's short and to the point. A quick text about an upcoming dinner we're hosting. A note about a bill that needs paying. Or a forwarded receipt. That's her style, efficient, no frills. This email, though, felt different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I clicked on it, expecting something minor. Maybe she'd redecorated one of the rooms in the house, or decided to book a weekend trip. But as my eyes moved over the lines of text, I felt my pulse slow, then quicken again. My breath caught in my throat, and I had to reread it to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I sold the beachfront villa, just tying up a little financial issue. You didn't really need it anyway, right? Love you. Lena. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of joke, a poorly thought out attempt at humor. I stared at the screen, waiting for a follow-up email to appear, one that would say, "Just kidding," or "Gotcha." But nothing came. The words sat there, unchanging, as the seconds ticked by. A chill crept up my spine. I sold the beachfront villa. She couldn't have meant it. Not the villa. The one I had poured years of planning into. The one I had meticulously designed down to the last detail. The mahogany doors custom made from a small workshop in Vermont. The floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Atlantic like a living painting. The secluded stretch of beach that felt like my own private sanctuary. That villa wasn't just property, it was a reflection of my effort, my taste, my success. And she had sold it, just tying up a little financial issue. What financial issue? She hadn't mentioned anything before. We weren't struggling. I knew exactly where our finances stood. I made sure of that. The accounts were solid, our investments performing well. There was no issue that would justify selling a home like that, let alone doing it without so much as a conversation. A quick, casual email was all she thought this warranted. You didn't really need it anyway, right? It wasn't about need. It was about the principle. It was my property, my investment. It was ours, technically, but she knew how much it meant to me. This wasn't some extra vacation home I rarely thought about. It was the villa, the place. I envisioned spending long weekends, hosting friends, eventually passing on to our kids. And now it was gone. I set my glass down carefully, my hand steady, even though a storm was brewing inside me. I opened my files, pulled up the deed, the purchase agreements, the insurance documents, all in my name. I had made sure of that. I had learned long ago that if you don't cover yourself legally, you're setting yourself up for trouble. Lena knew this too. She had to know. So how had she sold it? How had she managed to finalize a deal on something she had no legal right to sell? Forgery? Fraud? A loophole I'd overlooked? My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more infuriating than the last. I checked my email again, scrolling to see if I had missed any prior messages, warnings, hints, something that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just her casual, almost flippant announcement. Like she had rearranged the furniture, or booked a spa day. Not like she had sold a multi-million-dollar property behind my back. My phone was sitting on the desk. I stared at it for a long moment, considering whether to call her. But what would I say? I already knew how it would go. She'd downplay it, laugh it off, tell me I was being too dramatic. Maybe she'd claim it was a spur-of-the-moment decision or something we didn't really need anymore. She'd insist she was doing me a favor, making things simpler. I could hear her voice in my head, the calm, condescending tone she used whenever I was upset about something. It would infuriate me, and she'd act like I was the unreasonable one. No, I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. Instead, I turned back to the laptop, opening another tab. If the sale was legitimate, there would be a record of it. I started searching property records, transaction logs, anything that would confirm or deny what she had claimed. My fingers moved quickly, methodically, pulling up document after document. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding. The villa was gone, transferred to another owner, and my name was on the paperwork, even though I had never signed a single document. My hands tightened into fists. She had gone behind my back. She had lied, forged, stolen whatever it took to get what she wanted. I could feel the slow burn of anger rising in me, but I kept it controlled, focused. Anger wouldn't solve this. I needed to think, to plan, to figure out exactly how to respond. If she thought she could do this and get away with it, she had no idea who she was dealing with. I opened my email again and started typing. Marcus, my attorney, would be the first to hear about this. He'd know what to do, how to verify the sale, how to uncover the truth behind Lena's betrayal. I wrote out every detail I had, attached every document, and hit send. Then, I called the real estate agent who had handled the original purchase. I needed confirmation. I needed answers. By the time I was done, the city lights outside had blurred into a glowing haze. The exhaustion I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, determined resolve. I wouldn't let this slide. I wouldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. If she thought she had won, she was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The next morning, as I boarded the flight back to Los Angeles, the unease from Lena's email still churned in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Even as I sat in my seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine, my mind kept returning to those words. I sold the beachfront villa. How? Why? My phone was off, my laptop stowed, and the steady hum of the plane's engines only seemed to amplify the questions buzzing in my head. The villa wasn't just another asset. It was the culmination of years of hard work. A personal project I had thrown myself into. Something I had always considered untouchable. For Lena to sell it without so much as a conversation didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a betrayal. When I landed, I drove straight from LAX to our house, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with every mile. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. I needed to see her face when I asked her about this. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front yard, as I parked the car and walked inside. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you. I found her in the kitchen, scrolling on her tablet, a coffee mug resting on the counter. She didn't look up when I entered. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge me. But she didn't. Finally, I spoke. "So," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You sold the villa." She looked up, her expression neutral, as if I'd just commented on the weather. "Yes. I told you in the email." I stared at her, trying to keep my composure. "You didn't think we should talk about it first?" She set the tablet down and crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "What's there to talk about? We don't use it that often, and I needed the money." "The villa was in my name," I said, the words coming out slower than I intended. "You can't just decide to sell something that isn't yours." Her lips curved into a small, dismissive smile. "Daniel, it's not like I sold it to strangers. I used the money to pay off a debt, something I thought you'd understand." "A debt?" I repeated, my voice rising despite myself. "What debt?" "We don't have any debts, Lena. I've made sure of that." Her smile disappeared. For a moment, she hesitated, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Was it guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. But then, she straightened her shoulders and shrugged. "It's complicated, okay? I took care of it. Isn't that what matters? No, it wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that she had gone behind my back, forged my signature. There was no other way the sale could have gone through, and used the money without my knowledge. I didn't say it out loud, but I was sure she could see it in my expression. She knew she'd crossed a line, and yet, she stood there like it was no big deal. I leaned forward, my hands on the counter, trying to keep my voice steady. You sold our home, Lena. You lied to me. You forged my signature. And now you're telling me I should just let it go? She frowned, the corners of her mouth tightening. You're blowing this out of proportion. It's just a house, Daniel. We still have plenty of other investments. It's not like we're destitute. I straightened, exhaling slowly. The anger that had been simmering in my chest now felt like a slow, steady burn. It's not about the money, I said quietly. It's about trust. It's about respect. You had no right. Her eyes flashed with annoyance, and she pushed off the counter, stepping closer. I had every right. We're married. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That's how this works, Daniel. I shook my head. No, that's not how this works. Not when you go behind my back, not when you forge my name. That's not a partnership. That's theft. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but then she closed it again, turning away from me. She grabbed her coffee mug and took a sip, as if that could somehow end the conversation. I waited for her to say something, to offer an explanation, any explanation that made sense. But she didn't. I stepped back, running a hand through my hair. Why, Lena? Why did you do it? She set the mug down hard, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. I told you. I needed the money. For what? I pressed, my voice sharper now. What did you need that much money for? She turned back to me, her eyes narrowing. It's none of your business. None of my business? I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. You sold our home. You emptied our account. You stole my name, my signature. And you think it's none of my business? I didn't steal anything, she snapped, her voice rising. I handled it. Okay? You were always too busy to even notice. Too busy with your conferences and your deals, and your never-ending work schedule. I did what I had to do. I stared at her, the weight of her words settling on me like a lead blanket. It wasn't just the villa she'd taken. It was the trust, the partnership, the foundation of our marriage. She had done it without hesitation, without remorse. And now, she was standing here, justifying it, as if I was the one overreacting. You had no right, I said again, each word deliberate, measured. None. She glared at me, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. You think you're so perfect, don't you? Always in control. Always calling the shots. Well, maybe I was tired of waiting for you to pay attention to me. Maybe I was tired of being second to your career, your projects, your precious investments. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the villa. It wasn't just the money. It was everything. Years of resentment, of feeling ignored, of feeling like she didn't matter. But instead of talking to me, instead of working through it together, she had made a choice. A choice that destroyed whatever was left of the trust between us. I stood there for a long moment, staring at her, the woman I had once thought I knew so well. And then I turned and walked out. Not because I didn't have more to say, there was plenty I wanted to say, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. She had made up her mind. She had chosen her path. And now, I had to choose mine. So now you know the betrayal. But what would you do next? If you were me, would you let it go, or fight back with everything you've got? Comment 1 if you'd forgive her. Comment 2 if you'd destroy her. I'm curious what you would have done. Back in my home office, I pulled the blinds shut and sat down at the large mahogany desk where I'd planned countless deals, strategies, and future investments. Only this time, it wasn't about profit margins or portfolio growth. This was personal. The betrayal that had unfolded over the past few days was like a splinter under my skin. Impossible to ignore. My mind churned with questions. How long had Lena been planning this? Who else might have been involved? How far did the deception go? But above all, I needed one thing: proof. Cold, irrefutable proof that she had forged my signature, manipulated the sale, and taken the money. Without it, everything else would be speculation. With it, I could begin to dismantle the web she'd spun behind my back. I started with the documents. I already had copies of the original deed, purchase agreements, tax records, anything that bore my actual signature. I opened my file cabinet and pulled out the folder labeled Beachfront Villa, a thick bundle of neatly organized paperwork that covered every detail of the property from the day I first signed the deal to the most recent property tax assessment. This was my starting point, the foundation of my case. If Lena had truly forged my name, I needed to know exactly how it compared to my real signature. I needed to see it side by side, to find the discrepancies no one else would notice. After all, I'd signed my name thousands of times. I knew every curve, every flourish, every subtle shift in pressure. It was as distinct to me as my own reflection in the mirror. With the original documents laid out in front of me, I turned to the copies Lena had sent over via email. She hadn't been careful, not really. The signature was close, but not perfect. The more I examined it, the more obvious it became. The loops were too tight, the slant slightly off, and the way she had dotted the I in my last name wasn't something I'd ever done. I reached for a magnifying glass, a small but essential tool I kept in the drawer, and leaned in close, studying the pen strokes. There it was, a tremor in the line, a hesitation she probably hadn't even realized she'd made. She had copied my signature well enough to fool a busy real estate agent, but not well enough to fool me. This was the first crack in her plan, and I knew there were more. I moved on to the emails themselves. Lena had used my account to send a few messages to the agent, making it look as though I'd authorized the sale. I could see the timestamps, the language she had used, and the forwarding trail that led back to her personal address. It was amateurish, really. She hadn't even bothered to delete the email threads that showed her initiating the conversation from her own inbox, before switching to mine. I printed everything, highlighting the inconsistencies, and marking the timestamps where her story didn't match up. The more I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't a last-minute decision, or a one-time mistake. She had planned this, perhaps for weeks. Every email, every document, every piece of correspondence told the same story. Lena had gone behind my back, systematically setting up the sale and covering her tracks, all while pretending everything was fine between us. But what drove her to do it? That question nagged at me as I worked. I knew Lena, or at least I thought I did. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't reckless. For years, she had been careful, measured, even calculating in her own way. This kind of betrayal, this level of deception, didn't just happen out of nowhere. There had to be a reason, a trigger, something she felt was worth risking everything for. And that's when I started to think about the money. She hadn't just sold the villa, she'd funneled the funds somewhere. But where? To who? If she was willing to forge my signature, what else had she done with the money? I opened my financial accounts, combing through every transaction, looking for anything out of place. At first, everything seemed normal. The usual withdrawals for bills, the predictable expenses for household items. But then, tucked away in a list of recent transfers, I found it. A large sum of money sent to an account I didn't recognize. It wasn't one of our joint accounts, or a business account. It was something else entirely private, untraceable without further investigation. The account number was foreign to me, and the amount was far too large to be an accident. I jotted down the details, my mind racing. This was my next lead. I needed to find out who controlled that account, what it was connected to, and how Lena had accessed it. I knew she didn't have the technical expertise to set up something like this on her own. She had to have helped, someone who guided her through the process, someone who stood to gain as much as she did, if not more. The name Carter Sullivan popped into my mind. I hadn't thought much about him before. He was just one of the people Lena mentioned in passing, a friend of a friend who seemed to pop up at social events now and then. But now, as I stared at the account transfer details, his name kept coming back. It was a hunch, sure, but it made sense. Carter was smooth talking, charming in a way that always put me on edge. If anyone had helped Lena pull this off, it was him. I made a note to look into him further. If he was involved, I'd find the connection. As the hours slipped by, I became more methodical, piecing together a timeline of events. I wanted a complete picture of her actions, from the moment she first decided to sell the villa to the final transaction that moved the money out of our reach. I wrote it all down, cross-referencing emails, financial records, and property documents. By the time I looked up from my work, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows. I didn't turn on the lights. The darkness felt fitting, a reflection of the betrayal I was uncovering. I wasn't just looking at paperwork anymore. I was looking at a pattern of lies, a deliberate effort to undermine our marriage, our life together. Lena hadn't just crossed a line, she had burned the bridge behind her. I pushed back from the desk, the chair creaking under me, and ran a hand over my face. I had the evidence. The proof was undeniable. But what was my next move? Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to lay everything out and demand an explanation. But another part of me knew that wouldn't be enough. She'd have excuses, justifications, half-truths meant to deflect the blame. I needed more than a confrontation. I needed to make sure that when I acted, it would be decisive, final, and impossible for her to wriggle out of. This wasn't just about the villa anymore. It was about setting things right. It was about justice. I stood up, stretched my stiff shoulders, and glanced at the stack of documents on my desk. The proof was all there. Now, I just had to figure out what to do with it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The more I dug into the situation, the more my initial anger turned into something colder resolve. I wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. If Lena thought she could manipulate me, take what was mine, and walk away unscathed, she had another thing coming. I needed a strategy, not just proof. I needed to know exactly where every dollar went, who was involved, and how far this fraud extended. That's when I decided to bring in some professionals. I'd worked with top-tier financial advisors and forensic accountants before, people who could follow a money trail no matter how carefully it had been hidden. Now, I was going to leverage their expertise to unravel this web. I started with my attorney, Marcus Langley. He was the kind of lawyer you wanted on your side when things got messy. Sharp, thorough, and relentless, Marcus didn't just know the law, he understood how to use it to his client's advantage. I called him first thing in the morning, laying out everything I'd discovered so far. When I mentioned the forged signature, the unauthorized sale, and the suspicious bank transfers, Marcus didn't skip a beat. He was already taking notes, asking the right questions, and planning his next steps before I'd even finished explaining. "Daniel, this is serious," he said. "If she forged your signature and moved the money without your consent, we're not just looking at a civil matter. This is criminal. Identity theft, fraud, these are felonies. I'll need to pull every record, every document, and get in touch with the financial institutions involved. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case." His calm, methodical tone gave me some reassurance. Marcus wasn't the kind of guy to panic. He'd handled high-stakes corporate lawsuits, defended CEOs under scrutiny, and negotiated deals worth billions. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. I agreed to send over every file, every email, and every piece of correspondence I had. He promised to loop in a forensic accountant he'd worked with before, someone who could track down every cent Lena had taken, follow it to its final destination, and help us understand exactly what she'd done. Within a day, Marcus had assembled a small team to start the investigation. The forensic accountant, Lisa Harper, was one of the best in the business. She was meticulous, patient, and had a reputation for uncovering hidden accounts and fraudulent transactions in record time. When I first spoke with her, she assured me that no matter how complex the trail was, she'd find the truth. "Daniel, I've seen it all: offshore shell companies, fake invoices, ghost accounts. If Lena's been funneling money somewhere, I'll find it. Just give me access to the records, and I'll handle the rest." I emailed her everything: bank statements, transaction logs, and the details of the suspicious account I'd noticed. As she began combing through the numbers, Marcus started reaching out to the real estate agent who had facilitated the villa's sale. We needed their cooperation to confirm exactly how Lena had pushed the deal through. If we could get a statement, a copy of the sales contract, and any communication that tied Lena to the transaction, it would strengthen our case. Over the next few days, I stayed in constant contact with Marcus and Lisa. Each time I checked my email or answered a phone call, there was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Lisa confirmed that the account I'd flagged was indeed linked to an offshore financial institution. It was a classic move: transfer the funds out of the country, away from U.S. jurisdiction, and hope no one notices. But Lena hadn't covered her tracks as well as she thought. Lisa traced the money through 3 separate transfers before it landed in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. She even identified the intermediary bank that handled the initial wire transfer. "This isn't just sloppy," Lisa said during one of our calls. "She must have thought you'd never look into it. Once we file a report with the bank's compliance department, they'll be obligated to freeze that account. If she tries to move the money again, they'll flag it." Meanwhile, Marcus managed to get a hold of the real estate agent. At first, they were hesitant, understandable, considering they had unwittingly facilitated a fraudulent sale. But once Marcus explained the situation, they agreed to provide a statement. They confirmed that Lena had presented all the necessary paperwork, including a notarized signature. The problem was, the notary wasn't one they'd worked with before. Marcus dug deeper and discovered that the notary's credentials didn't check out. The name Lena had used belonged to someone who had left the profession years ago. The entire notarization was fraudulent, and that fact alone would be enough to invalidate the sale. Each new discovery made the case against Lena stronger. It wasn't just about recovering the money or undoing the sale. It was about sending a message that she couldn't get away with this. I knew it wasn't going to be quick or easy. Building a legal case takes time, and I had to be patient. But knowing I had Marcus and Lisa in my corner gave me a sense of control. For the first time since that email had landed in my inbox, I felt like I was taking the reins back. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was acting. I was planning. And I was one step closer to exposing Lena for what she'd done. As I watched everything come together, I realized something else. Lena's actions hadn't just shaken my trust in her. They had forced me to look at my own blind spots. The places where I'd been too trusting, too focused on my work to notice what was happening in my own home. I had let my guard down, assuming that because I was careful in business, my personal life was immune to betrayal. But now, I saw how wrong I'd been. This wasn't just about Lena. It was about learning to protect myself, not just as a businessman, but as a person. And as I continued piecing together the evidence, I knew one thing for sure: Lena thought she had the upper hand. She thought she could outsmart me, play the victim, and keep what she'd stolen. But she had underestimated me. She didn't realize that once I set my mind to something, I didn't stop until I achieved it. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And when it was done, Lena would know exactly what happens when you cross me. Every step of the process was deliberate. I wasn't just following a trail, I was setting the stage. Lena had assumed that I'd react with a flash of anger, maybe shout or argue, then eventually let the whole thing blow over. But this wasn't going away. With Marcus and Lisa laying the groundwork, I began to piece together how to use the mounting evidence not just as a shield, but as a weapon. If Lena thought she could quietly move my money into an offshore account and live happily ever after, she was sorely mistaken. I was going to make sure she felt every single consequence of her decisions. Lisa's detailed financial trace revealed more than just numbers. It painted a picture of intent. The money didn't just disappear into one account. It was transferred into several, then funneled through shell companies, corporations that existed only on paper, each with names bland enough to escape casual notice. To the untrained eye, it might look like routine business. But Lisa knew better, and so did I. This wasn't just a slip-up or a moment of desperation. Lena had gone to great lengths to hide her tracks. That only made her betrayal worse. She knew exactly what she was doing. It didn't take long for Lisa to identify one of the shell companies as being tied to Carter Sullivan. When she brought me the news, her voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the undertone of disbelief. "This guy isn't just a friend of Lena's," she said. "He's a serial scam artist. I've seen his name pop up before in cases involving fraudulent loans and fake investment schemes. If he's involved, he's the one pulling the strings." Carter. The name had been in the back of my mind since the beginning, but hearing Lisa confirm it solidified my suspicion. I had never trusted him. The few times I met him at social events, something about his charm felt practiced, his smile too calculated. He was always a little too eager to strike up conversations about opportunities, but I'd never taken the bait. Lena must have fallen for his pitch. Or maybe she knew what he was and didn't care. Either way, it was clear that he was a central figure in this mess. If Lena had given him the money, she was even more foolish than I thought. And if he had convinced her to do it, then I wasn't just dealing with her betrayal. I was dealing with a professional conman who thought he could make me his mark. That's when I decided to dig deeper into Carter's background. I called in a favor from a friend in private security, a guy I'd worked with before when I needed discreet checks on potential business partners. He owed me one, and this was the perfect time to cash in. Within a few days, I had a dossier on Carter Sullivan. He had a trail of ruined lives behind him, women who had trusted him, invested with him, and ended up bankrupt when he disappeared. He changed cities, used aliases, and relied on people underestimating him. But now, he had gone too far. He wasn't dealing with someone who would cut their losses and walk away. He was dealing with me. As the puzzle pieces came together, I began to see the bigger picture. Lena and Carter hadn't just stolen from me, they had created a house of cards. Carter might have been the one giving Lena advice, telling her how to move the money and cover her tracks. But his ego was his weakness. He was confident, too confident, that I wouldn't figure it out in time. And Lena, for all her cunning, didn't have the experience or the instincts to pull off something this complex without leaving a trail. With the shell companies identified, and the offshore accounts linked back to Carter, I knew where to apply pressure. I had Marcus draft legal notices to freeze the accounts, block any further transfers, and alert the banks to the fraudulent activity. Lisa worked with the financial institutions' compliance teams, presenting them with the evidence so they would be ready to act. The moment we filed the formal charges, everything was lining up, but I wasn't done yet. This was about more than just stopping them. This was about sending a message. Lena might have thought she'd covered all her bases, but she hadn't counted on how far I'd go. As I built my case, I began to reach out to my contacts in the media, journalists I'd worked with over the years who knew the value of a well-documented expose. I started laying the groundwork for a story that would turn public opinion against Lena and Carter before they even had a chance to respond. By the time the legal system caught up with them, their reputations would be in shreds. The world would know what they'd done. Every night, as I reviewed the latest findings, I thought about the way Lena had looked at me in the kitchen that day. The casual dismissal in her tone, the way she acted as if I was overreacting, as if what she'd done was no big deal. That memory fueled me. She had gambled on my trust, counted on my patience, and assumed I'd be too busy, too distracted, to fight back. But she'd underestimated me. I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to make sure she understood exactly what happens when you cross me. By the end of that week, I had a plan in place. Marcus was ready to file the initial complaints. Lisa had traced every dollar, pinpointing each fraudulent transaction. And Carter? He was starting to squirm. My private security contact informed me that Carter had been making quiet inquiries, looking into flights out of the country. He was beginning to realize the walls were closing in. It wouldn't be long before he tried to run, and I was ready for that too. I had already tipped off the authorities, providing them with enough evidence to ensure that Carter wouldn't make it through airport security without a set of handcuffs waiting for him on the other side. Lena and Carter thought they had me. They thought they'd played me, outsmarted me. But they were wrong. I wasn't just playing defense anymore, I was on the attack. And when this was all over, they'd wish they'd never tried to steal from me. With everything coming to a head, I knew that the next move had to be perfect. I couldn't afford to let Lena or Carter catch wind of what I was planning. The element of surprise was my biggest advantage, and I intended to keep it that way. Every piece of evidence, every financial record, every fraudulent signature, it was all in place. Marcus had ensured that the legal groundwork was solid. Lisa had traced every dollar with surgical precision. And the team I'd assembled behind the scenes was primed to act as soon as I gave the word. But the truth was, this wasn't just about justice. It was personal. Lena's betrayal had cut deeper than I'd let myself admit. There were nights I couldn't sleep, lying awake in the darkness, replaying every conversation, every moment where she'd smiled at me, assured me everything was fine, while secretly plotting to take what was mine. The weight of it settled on my chest like a cinder block. I tried to push it aside, to stay focused, but the anger kept bubbling up. Carter was just as culpable, maybe more so. He'd played his role perfectly, whispering in Lena's ear, showing her how to cover her tracks, giving her the tools to try and bring me down. They thought they were untouchable. They thought I'd never figure it out, but I had. And now, I was ready. I spent the following days preparing in silence. I stopped replying to Lena's texts, stopped acknowledging her altogether. When we crossed paths in the house, I kept my distance. She knew something was wrong. I could see it in her eyes. She was starting to realize that her plan wasn't as airtight as she'd thought. She even tried to play the victim, dropping hints about feeling overwhelmed, about needing time to work things out. But I didn't bite, I just watched, let her squirm. Every word she said only strengthened my resolve. She'd made her choice, and now, she'd have to face the consequences. Carter was harder to keep track of. He was slippery, always staying one step ahead of trouble. But the net was closing in. My private security contact had traced his movements, confirming that he was laying low in a condo downtown, one that was conveniently tied to one of the shell companies Lisa had uncovered. It was a modest place, not the kind of flashy pad you'd expect for someone with stolen money. That told me he wasn't planning to stay put. He was buying time, waiting for the right moment to disappear. I made a call to Marcus and updated him on what I'd learned. We need to move quickly, I told him. Before he has a chance to run. Marcus's voice was steady, as always. We're ready. The subpoenas are in place. As soon as you give the green light, we'll have the banks lock down every account. Once that happens, Carter won't be able to move so much as a dime without it being flagged. And Lena? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. What about her? She'll be hit with the same legal actions. Fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. She won't have any wiggle room. The moment we file, she'll be under investigation. I hung up and stared out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. I knew what was coming. Once I set the plan in motion, there'd be no going back. The image of Lena being served with papers, the look of panic on her face, was satisfying in theory. But there was a part of me, however small, that hated what this had come to. I had loved her once, trusted her, and she'd thrown it all away for what? A few months of thrills? A promise from Carter that he couldn't even keep? The anger flared again, pushing the doubt aside. She had made her choice. Now she'd have to live with it. The next morning, I met with Marcus in person. We sat in a quiet conference room, the table covered with stacks of documents. Lisa joined us via video call, her screen filled with charts and account details. Everything was laid out: the timeline of Lena's deception, the fake notary signatures, the trail of money leading to Carter's offshore accounts. Marcus walked me through the legal strategy step by step. Once we filed, Lena and Carter would be served within 24 hours. From there, the authorities would take over. The case against them was airtight. They could try to deny it, try to shift blame, but the evidence was overwhelming. Are you sure you're ready for this? Marcus asked as we wrapped up the meeting. Once we pull the trigger, it's going to get messy. I nodded, my expression grim. I'm ready. That evening, I sat alone in my home office, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the room. I thought about what Lena might be doing at that moment. Was she sitting in the living room, scrolling through her tablet, completely unaware of what was about to happen? Or was she pacing, nervous, wondering if I'd figured it all out? I imagined Carter, too, sitting in that downtown condo, probably sipping a drink, thinking he was untouchable. The thought made my jaw tighten. They had no idea what was coming. I hit send on the final email to Marcus, giving him the green light. In that moment, it felt like a weight had lifted. I had done everything I could to prepare. Now, it was just a matter of time. The next day, Marcus called with an update. The papers have been served, he said. It's official. They can't touch any of the money. The accounts are frozen, and the legal proceedings are underway. We've already heard from Lena's lawyer. She's claiming it's all a misunderstanding, but we both know that won't hold up. I thanked him, and hung up, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. Lena had underestimated me. So had Carter. They thought they could outsmart me, play me for a fool. But they were wrong. I wasn't the type to let something like this slide. They were about to learn that the hard way. As the days passed, I began to see the fallout. Lena became more withdrawn, more anxious. She stopped making small talk, stopped pretending everything was fine. Carter, on the other hand, tried to act as if nothing was happening. But I knew better. My private security contact informed me that he'd started asking about flights out of the country. He was trying to run. I wasn't surprised. The pressure was mounting, And Carter was no stranger to cutting his losses and disappearing. But this time, I was one step ahead. I had already alerted the authorities. By the time he tried to leave, they'd be waiting for him. The night before Carter was scheduled to skip town, I sat back in my chair, watching the city skyline. The fight wasn't over yet, but I was close. I could feel it. And when it was done, I knew one thing for certain: they'd both regret ever thinking they could cross me. I waited until dusk to make my move. The city seemed to hold its breath as I drove downtown, the sun sinking lower, turning the sky shades of orange and purple. Carter's condo was on the 8th floor of a nondescript building, nothing fancy, but definitely not cheap. It was the kind of place someone would hole up if they wanted to stay off the radar, without slumming it. I'd been tracking his movements for days, using every resource I had. My private security contact had already confirmed he was there, lying low, probably thinking he was safe for a little while longer. He had no idea what was coming. I parked a block away and killed the engine, letting the silence settle. The streets were quieter than usual, the air heavy with that strange stillness you sometimes get in the city. I stayed in the car for a moment, running through everything in my mind. I wasn't here to confront him face to face. That would be too messy, too unpredictable. Instead, I wanted to see the condo with my own eyes, confirm that he was still there, that he hadn't already slipped away. My plan was already in motion. Marcus and Lisa had seen to that. The financial accounts were locked, the legal paperwork had been filed, and Carter was under surveillance. But I needed to be sure. I needed to know he hadn't weaseled his way out while we tightened the noose. I stepped out of the car and blended into the sidewalk crowd, keeping my head down. My heart pounded, though I tried to play it cool. I wasn't sure what I'd do if he spotted me. Maybe he wouldn't recognize me right away, but if he did, it'd blow my cover. I didn't want him to know I'd been watching him. Not yet. As I approached the building, I looked up at the windows. The 8th floor was lit. I couldn't see much from the street, just the faint glow of light spilling through the curtains. But that was enough. He was still there. I walked past the entrance and turned down the side alley, scanning for anything that might give me an edge. A side door, a service entrance, something. I wasn't planning to break in, I just wanted to be sure no one else was coming or going. The alley was empty, except for a few dumpsters and a delivery van parked near the back. I lingered there for a few minutes, my back against the wall, the scent of garbage faint in the warm air. No movement, no sound. It was almost too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I pushed it aside. I had come this far. I wasn't turning back now. When I circled back around, I crossed the street and ducked into a small cafe. From there, I had a clear view of the building. I ordered a coffee, just to keep up appearances, and took a seat near the window. The cup was warm in my hands, the bitter aroma steadying my nerves. I kept my eyes on the entrance, waiting, watching. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. The 8th floor light stayed on, the curtains still drawn. No one came in or out. He was still up there, probably feeling safe, thinking he had a few more days to lay low before making his next move. It was almost laughable. The man who had spent his life running, always a step ahead of the law, didn't even realize how close I was to closing in on him. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from Marcus. Got word from the bank. The account is frozen. He won't get another dime out of it. I smiled, a grim satisfaction settling over me. It was all falling into place. Carter had played his last hand, and now it was only a matter of time before he realized the game was over. I thought about the money he'd taken, the promises he must have made to Lena to keep her on his side. How many times had he whispered in her ear, assuring her that I wouldn't figure it out, that I'd be too busy, too distracted to notice. And now here he was, hiding in a condo that wasn't even under his real name, hoping to buy enough time to slip away unnoticed. He must have thought he was untouchable. But he'd never dealt with someone like me. As the night deepened, I made one more call. My private security contact picked up on the second ring. He's still there, I said. Hasn't moved. Good. The voice on the other end replied. We'll keep an eye on him. You want us to keep the pressure on? No, I said. Not yet, let him sit a while longer. I want him to feel comfortable, like nothing's wrong. Then we'll make our move. Got it. I'll keep you posted. I hung up and stared out the window. The streets were quieter now, only the occasional car passing by. The cafe had emptied out, the barista wiping down tables, getting ready to close. I sat there a while longer, sipping my coffee, my mind turning over the possibilities. I knew this wouldn't end with a simple arrest. Carter wasn't the kind of guy who'd go down quietly. He'd fight, try to talk his way out of it, maybe even throw Lena under the bus. But it didn't matter. I was ready for that. I had the evidence, the legal team, the resources to see this through to the end. As I finally left the cafe and walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of calm. The tension that had been building for weeks was still there, but it was no longer a frantic, anxious energy. It was controlled, focused. I had done everything I could to prepare. Now it was just a matter of waiting. Carter would make his move eventually, he always did. And when he did, I'd be ready. I wasn't just going to watch him fall. I was going to make sure he never got back up. Sitting in my car, parked a block away from Carter's condo, I glanced at my phone. No new messages, no updates. The streetlights cast a pale glow on the wet pavement, and a slight drizzle tapped against the windshield. I should have been more anxious, should have felt the tension crawling up my spine. But instead, there was a kind of calmness washing over me, a cold, sharp focus that I hadn't felt in weeks. Carter didn't know it yet, but his time was up. The noose was tightening, and all I needed to do now was wait. He thought he had the upper hand, thought he could outmaneuver me. But Carter had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated who he was dealing with. A soft hum from the building's lobby caught my attention. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered. His head ducked low as he lit a cigarette. I tensed, leaning forward slightly. But it wasn't him, just some other tenant out for a smoke. My grip on the steering wheel relaxed. I checked the time, just past 9. He had to be inside. I'd done my homework. Carter rarely left after sundown. He was too paranoid, too careful. It was only a matter of time before he slipped up. The thought sent a faint, grim smile to my lips. I wasn't here to confront him directly, that would come later. After all the pieces fell into place. Tonight, I was making sure the final threads of his safety net were unraveled. I grabbed the folder off the passenger seat, flipping it open under the dim light of the dashboard. Inside were printouts of the bank transfers, screenshots of his offshore accounts, and the documents Lisa had painstakingly compiled. It was all there, undeniable proof that Carter had orchestrated this entire scheme. He had used Lena, convinced her to funnel the money into his network of shell companies, and was now sitting on a small fortune he thought was safe. Except it wasn't. By now, Marcus would have already filed the necessary motions. The banks were freezing his accounts, the authorities were preparing charges, and Carter's days of hiding were over. I thought back to the moment I realized he was behind it all. The phone call from Lisa, the smug tone in her voice as she confirmed his name on one of the wire transfers. Carter Sullivan, she'd said. Your wife isn't just involved. She's in bed, figuratively, and literally, with a known con man. I had clenched my jaw so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. Carter wasn't just some sleazy boyfriend. He was a professional scam artist with a record of destroying lives, leaving a trail of victims too broken to fight back. He'd preyed on Lena's insecurities, fed her lies about how she deserved better, how I didn't care. And she'd bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. The rain started to pick up, droplets streaking down the glass, blurring my view of the building. My phone buzzed, just a notification from an old news app. I ignored it, my focus still locked on that 8th floor window. The light was on, faintly glowing behind closed curtains. He was there. I knew it. I could almost picture him pacing, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. Did he know yet? Had he checked his accounts, realized they were frozen? Or was he still sitting comfortably, sipping a drink, thinking he was untouchable? I hoped it was the latter. I wanted him to feel that moment of pure panic, the sinking realization that everything he thought was secure had just slipped through his fingers. I adjusted my seat, feeling the leather creak under me. The coffee from earlier was wearing off, but I didn't dare leave my post. I wanted to be here when it all went down. Not that I'd be rushing into the building, or banging on his door, that wasn't my style. I was playing the long game, making sure every move I made was calculated, deliberate. Carter wasn't going to walk out of this unscathed. I'd see to that. Another tenant exited the building, a woman with a small dog on a leash. She hurried across the street, pulling her coat tight against the drizzle. I watched her disappear into a neighboring building before returning my attention to the 8th floor. No movement. No sign of life except for that dim light. I shifted my gaze back to the folder. There were more papers underneath: contracts, legal filings, even a list of the aliases Carter had used in previous scams. He was good, I'd give him that. He'd fooled plenty of people before. But this time, he'd made a critical error. He hadn't just targeted some wealthy widow, or a naive investor. He'd come after me. He'd stepped into my world. And now he was about to learn the hard way why that was a mistake. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus. I answered quickly, keeping my voice low. "What's the word?" "It's done," he said. "The accounts are locked, the motions are filed, and the authorities are aware. If Carter tries to move any funds, they'll know immediately. He's trapped." I leaned back in the seat, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. "Good. What's next?" "Now we wait," Marcus replied. "If he tries to run, we have people watching. If he stays put, the charges will catch up to him soon enough. Either way, he won't have a chance to slip through the cracks." I thanked him, and hung up. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. Everything was set in motion, and it was only a matter of time before Carter's world came crashing down. I glanced at the building one last time, the rain now falling steadily, obscuring the details of the facade. It didn't matter, he was in there. And soon, he'd realize that the man he thought he'd fooled wasn't just going to sit quietly and let it happen. Carter had underestimated me. So had Lena. But they wouldn't make that mistake again. By the time it was all over, the rain had stopped. The streets were slick and gleaming under the soft glow of the streetlights, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. It hadn't been easy, not by a long shot. But sitting there in my car, watching the faint glow from Carter's 8th floor window, I knew I'd done everything I set out to do. He hadn't come out. He hadn't run. He was still up there, probably pacing, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how the walls had closed in so quickly. And that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done, to realize that every move he'd made, every choice, had led him straight into a trap. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't just about getting back what was rightfully mine. It was about making sure they both knew they couldn't play me, not Carter, not Lena. She thought she could betray me, sell me out for a quick payday, and just walk away. She thought I'd fold under the pressure, that I'd let it slide like I had in the past. But this time was different. This time, I was the one in control. I thought back to that morning when Marcus had called with the final update. "It's done," he'd said, his voice calm and steady. "The charges are filed. The accounts are locked. And we've got Carter dead to rights. The authorities are moving in today. Once they have him in custody, it's over." I'd nodded, gripping the phone tighter. "Good. Make sure it sticks." Marcus had assured me it would. The evidence Lisa had gathered was airtight. Carter couldn't wiggle out of it, no matter how slick he thought he was. And Lena, well, her trail of fraud and deceit was just as solid. There was no way they could talk their way out of this. But even as I sat there, knowing it was done, knowing I'd won, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, yes. Satisfaction, absolutely. But there was also a lingering sense of loss. I couldn't deny it. Lena had been my wife. We'd shared a life together, or at least I'd thought we had. And now, that life was gone, destroyed by her choices. There was no going back, no forgiveness, no second chances. She'd crossed a line, and there was no coming back from that. But still, a part of me mourned what could have been, what should have been. I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. There was no point dwelling on it. What's done is done. I looked up at the building again, my eyes narrowing. The light was still on, but there was no movement. Carter had to know by now that something was wrong. He'd tried to move money, Lisa had confirmed that much, and found that everything was frozen. No offshore accounts, no emergency funds, no escape plan. He was trapped. And now he was probably scrambling, trying to figure out his next move. But it was too late. The authorities were already on their way, and when they showed up, he wouldn't have a chance to run. The sound of a siren in the distance snapped me out of my thoughts. It wasn't coming this way, Just another reminder of the city's constant hum. I leaned back in my seat, my mind racing through everything that had led up to this moment. The initial betrayal, the fake signature, the offshore transfers, it all felt like a lifetime ago. I'd been blindsided at first, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of it all. But now, looking back, I could see it for what it was. Lena had been lying to me for months, maybe longer. And Carter, he'd been there the whole time, pulling the strings, whispering in her ear, convincing her that she deserved more, that I wasn't enough. They thought they'd won. But they were wrong. I glanced at my phone again. Still no updates. I tapped out a quick message to Marcus. "Let me know as soon as it's done." He replied almost instantly. "Will do." I knew it wouldn't be long now. The plan was in motion. And once Carter was taken into custody, it would all be over. I could finally close this chapter and move on. But what did moving on even mean? My life had been turned upside down. The woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I'd spent weeks digging through financial records, meeting with lawyers, and building a case, instead of focusing on my career, my friends, my future. Moving on felt like a distant concept, something I couldn't quite wrap my head around. But I would. I had to. Once this was over, I could start rebuilding. I'd already made plans to sell the house, to get out of the city for a while. Maybe a few months in the mountains, somewhere quiet and far away from the noise and chaos. I needed time to think, to figure out what was next, and maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to trust again. Not now. Not soon. But someday. I exhaled, the sound loud in the quiet car. The rain had stopped completely now, the clouds breaking up to reveal a few faint stars. It felt like the storm had passed, not just outside, but inside me as well. The anger, the frustration, the sense of betrayal, it was still there, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. I had channeled it into action, into a plan that had worked. Carter was finished. Lena was finished. And I was still standing. As the minutes ticked by, I finally saw what I'd been waiting for. A pair of unmarked cars pulled up to the building, their lights off. Men in plain clothes got out, moving quickly and purposefully toward the entrance. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. They were here for Carter. This was it. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just watched as they entered the building. A few minutes later, they came back out, this time with Carter in tow. He was cuffed, his head down, his posture defeated. They put him in the back of one of the cars and drove off, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a while longer, just letting it all sink in. It was over. I'd done it. The next day, Marcus called with the final confirmation. Carter had been charged, and Lena's case was progressing. "They won't get away with it," he assured me. "You've won, Daniel. It's over." I thanked him, hung up, and stood by the window, staring out at the city. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the buildings in warm hues of orange and gold. It was a new day, a new beginning. I had a long road ahead, healing, rebuilding, moving forward, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd come out of this stronger. They'd tried to break me, to take everything I'd worked for. And they'd failed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. This was the start of something new. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. She thought she'd won. She thought I'd let it slide. But what she never saw coming was my next move, one that turned her world upside down. If you want to see what happened after this, make sure to comment below. Tell me how you'd handle it. Let's hear your thoughts. Trust isn't just given, it's earned. I learned the hard way that even those closest to you can betray your faith. That's why it's crucial for every American to protect their financial assets and know where their money is going. Regularly check your accounts, keep an eye on legal documents, and never ignore red flags, no matter how small. This country was built on independence and hard work. Don't let anyone take that from you. Stay vigilant, ask questions, and hold people accountable. Because once trust is broken, it's a long road back. Protect what you've built. Protect yourself.